Susan Bonney had been watching her father Tom Bonney for a long time. Not because she suspected anything, but because that was simply what you did in the Bonney house. You watched. You stayed quiet. And you paid attention to his moods. On the evening of November 21st, 1987, she slipped out of the house and walked to the 7-Eleven near their home in Chesapeake, Virginia. Her father and her older sister, Kathy, had left together about an hour earlier, and he had told the family he was taking Kathy to look at a truck someone had for sale. That was what he said, and Susan wanted to see for herself. She found them in the car, parked outside the store. Kathy was in the passenger seat. Their father was behind the wheel. Everything looked ordinary. Susan watched them for a moment, then walked back home. She had no reason to worry. Well, not yet. About 2 hours later, her father came through the front door, alone. He looked around the room and asked if anyone knew where Kathy was. And of course nobody did, because left the house with her a few hours ago. How does a father drive away with his daughter and come home without her, and then ask the family where she went? And what exactly happened between the time Susan saw them together outside that 7-Eleven and the moment Tom Bonney walked back through that door alone? In this video, I will lay out the precise details of this case. But what exactly happened to Kathy Bonney? And who was actually responsible for her disappearance? This is the story of Kathy Carol Bonney. Chesapeake, Virginia, a sprawling independent city sitting at the southeastern corner of the state, covering over 340 square miles of terrain that shifts between suburban neighborhoods, farmland, forests, and vast wetlands. In 1987, when this story took place, Chesapeake was still a relatively rural and suburban city, where residents typically commuted from nearby larger cities. Now here's something most people do not know about Chesapeake. The city contains more miles of deep-water canals than any other city in the entire country. And sitting right at the southern edge of Chesapeake, stretching across the Virginia-North Carolina border, is one of the most historically significant waterways in the United States, the Dismal Swamp Canal. Opened in 1805, it is the oldest continually operating man-made canal in the United States, running along the eastern edge of the Great Dismal Swamp and connecting the waters of the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia all the way down to the Albemarle Sound in North Carolina. George Washington himself first visited the Great Dismal Swamp in May 1763 and proposed the idea of digging a north-south canal through it. Construction started in 1793 and the canal was dug completely by hand. It took approximately 12 years to complete the 22-mile waterway. Today it draws recreational boaters, kayakers, and history enthusiasts from across the country. Kathy Carol Bonney was born on August 6, 1968, in Norfolk, Virginia. She was the oldest of 6 children born to Thomas Lee Bonney and Dorothy May Bonney. By the time she was 19 years old, the family was living in Chesapeake, Virginia, where her father ran an auto salvage yard. Kathy had grown up entirely in this corner of southeastern Virginia, in a household that, from the outside, looked like a working-class family doing what working-class families do. A father with a business, a mother holding the home together, 6 children moving through school, through chores, through the ordinary friction of shared domestic life. But the texture of life inside that house was not ordinary. Kathy's younger sister Susan would later describe their father as strict in a way that went beyond discipline. Tom Bonney did not allow his children to date. He monitored their movements. He was controlling in ways that shaped how all of his children carried themselves, how they spoke, what they did with their time, and who they spent it with. For Kathy, the oldest, that control had a particular weight. She was 19. She had her own inner life, her own relationships, her own sense of who she was becoming, and she was navigating all of that inside a home where those things were not freely permitted. What we know about Kathy in the final period of her life suggests a young woman who was finding her footing in the world in spite of those constraints. She had a lover. She was writing letters, personal and candid letters, to someone she cared about. She had formed a life that existed, at least in part, outside the walls of the family home and outside her father's field of vision. She had kept a diary. She had her own thoughts about the future. She was 19 years old, and she was, in the quiet and unremarkable way that most people her age are, simply trying to live. John McClung, a man who had been Tom Bonney's business partner for around 14 years, knew Kathy personally. He described Tom Bonney as a man with a poor memory and a tendency toward sharp, sudden mood swings, particularly around topics involving religion or the Bible. He also described something he called a love-hate relationship between Tom and his own father, a tension that had followed Tom Bonney into his adult life and into the way he ran his household. McClung had never seen Tom physically strike any of his children. In his opinion, he said, Tom Bonney loved Kathy, but on cross-examination, during proceedings that came much later, McClung acknowledged something else entirely. Kathy herself had told him, at some point, that her father had hit her. More than once. One of those small, ordinary things that defined Kathy to the people closest to her was simply this. When she was home, she was present. She was the oldest. She kept an eye on her younger siblings. She knew the rhythms of that house better than anyone, and she moved through them with the particular awareness of someone who had learned, from a young age, to read the room. On the evening of November 21st, 1987, when her father told the family he was taking her out to look at a truck, she got into the car. She went with him, because that was what you did. Then Tom Bonney came home, alone. He walked in, looked around, and asked the family if anyone had seen Kathy. The question landed strangely. He had left with her. He was the last person who had been with her. But the question came out of his mouth as though Kathy's whereabouts were simply a small domestic mystery, the kind that resolves itself in an hour or two. Nobody in the family had seen her. Of course they hadn't. She had left with him. Susan went back out to the 7-Eleven to look for her sister. She checked the store. She checked the lot. Kathy was not there. When Susan came back to the car to head home, she looked inside it, and she stopped. There was blood on the front passenger seat. She stared at it for a moment. Then she told her mother. The two of them made a quiet, private accounting of what that might mean, and they landed on the explanation that felt the least wrong. Her father must have picked up an injured animal. That happened sometimes with a man who ran a salvage yard. That was what they told themselves. Susan did not mention the blood to her father. She did not ask him about it directly. Tom Bonney did not go out looking for Kathy that night. He stayed home while his teenage daughter retraced the last known steps of her older sister on foot. In the dark, checking a convenience store parking lot for someone who was already gone. The night passed. Kathy did not come home. The following morning, Sunday, November 22nd, Tom Bonney drove to the Chesapeake Police Department and reported his daughter missing. He told the officer on duty, a man named Jeffrey Hardison, that the previous evening he had taken Kathy to the 7-Eleven to meet a man she knew, a man named John, who was selling a Chevrolet Blazer. According to Bonney, Kathy had gone for a test drive with this man at around 9 o'clock in the evening and had not come back. Bonney told the officer he had not grown suspicious until that morning because Kathy had stayed out all night on one previous occasion. Officer Hardison noted that Bonney appeared nervous during this exchange. He told Bonney that because Kathy was an adult, a missing persons report could not formally be filed until 24 hours had elapsed. Bonney thanked him and left. Kathy had texted no one that night. She had called no one. She had not checked in with her mother, or with Susan, or with anyone who would have expected to hear from her. For a young woman living in a controlled household, navigating a private life her father did not approve of, the absence of any outward contact after 9 o'clock on a Saturday night might, on its own, have seemed plausible. She was 19. She had stayed out before. But Susan knew the difference between her sister staying out and her sister vanishing. And Susan had seen the blood on that seat. By early afternoon on November 22nd, the question of where Kathy Bonney had gone was no longer a family matter. It was about to become something much larger. Thomas Lee Bonney was, by most outward measures, a working man with a business and a family. He ran an auto salvage yard in Chesapeake, Virginia, and had done so for years. He was known in his community, had long-standing professional relationships, and moved through his daily life with the kind of local familiarity that comes from spending decades in the same place. Tom Bonney's childhood had not been easy. His defense attorneys would later present evidence that he had suffered physical abuse at the hands of his father during his early years, a history that had left marks that were still legible in his adult behavior, in his relationships, in the way he ran his household, and in the way he responded when his authority was challenged. He had 6 children with his wife Dorothy, and the household he built around them reflected the household he had grown up in at least one significant respect. Control was the organizing principle. His children did not date. They did not bring outside relationships into the home without his approval. They operated within boundaries he set and enforced. For Kathy, the oldest child, those boundaries had become increasingly difficult to contain her within. She was 19 years old and she had a life that existed beyond what her father could see or supervise. She had a lover. She had been writing letters, candid and personal letters, to a man her father would not have approved of. She kept those letters in her room, alongside a diary, alongside other private things. Tom Bonney did not know about all of it, or if he did, he had not yet confronted her about it directly. But in the days immediately before November 21st, 1987, something shifted. Tom Bonney found copies of letters Kathy had written to a man named John Hoskins, a former employee of his whom he had fired approximately 10 days earlier. He read those letters. He described them later to investigators as vulgar and shocking. He said they disturbed him deeply. What those letters contained, specifically, was a portrait of his daughter's inner life that he had not been given access to and had not expected to find. They described an affair with a married man. They described a prior sexual relationship. They were written in a voice that was entirely Kathy's own, a voice that had nothing to do with the life her father had designed for her inside that house. He found them on Friday, November 20th, the day before he drove her to the 7-Eleven and came home alone. He held on to that information for 24 hours. He said nothing to her about it until the following evening, when they were alone together in the car, parked on the side of a highway in the dark. On the morning of November 22nd, 1987, while Tom Bonney was at the Chesapeake Police Department filing his missing persons report, a man named Wesley Lindquist was driving his truck along Highway 17. Heading from Chesapeake, Virginia, down toward the outskirts of Elizabeth City, North Carolina. At some point during that doctor he turned around and headed back toward Virginia. And somewhere along that stretch of road, near the state line, running alongside the dismal swamp canal, he pulled over. He got out of his truck and walked toward the embankment that dropped away from the road toward the canal. The sides were steep and rocky, filled with brush and small trees. He looked down into that tangle of vegetation and rock, and at the bottom of it, he saw the body of a young woman. Lindquist got back in his truck and drove up the road until he could find a phone. He called the police at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Officers arrived approximately 15 minutes later. Sergeant Edward Lewis, a member of the Chesapeake Police Department dive team, was called to the scene and arrived around 7 o'clock that evening. What he found when he got there was a scene that told its own story before a single piece of evidence had been formally logged. The position of the body at the base of that embankment, the angle of the bank, the density of the brush between the road and the water, all of it pointed to one conclusion in Lewis's professional assessment. This person had not been carried down there. She had gone over the edge. The physical evidence at the scene was extensive. The surrounding vegetation showed signs consistent with ballistic impact, with small trees in the immediate area displaying damage that would later be formally examined. Fibers from that vegetation were recovered from the victim's hair, consistent with a body having traveled through dense brush on its way down the embankment. A green sweater and an undergarment were recovered from the water near the body. There were marks on both wrists consistent with restraint. There was no firearm recovered at the scene, no shell casings, no restraint devices, and critically, there was no forensic evidence on the ground around the body to suggest the fatal events had taken place at this location. She had not been harmed here. She had been left here. The victim's face had sustained sufficient trauma that visual identification at the scene was not possible. Detective Martin Williams, who responded that evening, was unable to make a positive identification even with the victim's driver's license in hand. He telephoned Tom Bonney that night to ask if he could come to the family home and to collect a photograph of Kathy. Bonney told him it was too late. The officer would have to wait until the next day. The formal identification came on Wednesday, November 25th, when fingerprints lifted from Kathy's bedroom were matched against those taken from the victim at the scene. It was confirmed. The young woman found alongside the dismal swamp canal was Kathy Carol Bonney, 19 years old, of Chesapeake, Virginia. When Tom Bonney was told, he became extremely upset. He began yelling. He fell to the floor. Paramedics were called to assist him. The medical examiner's findings, delivered through the subsequent forensic examination, established several things that would become central to the investigation going forward. The examination confirmed that Kathy had sustained fatal injuries consistent with multiple ballistic impacts across several regions of her body. The forensic timeline established that some of those impacts had occurred before death, and that additional impacts had been documented after death had already occurred. The examination also confirmed, through a standard forensic kit, that there was no evidence of the assault of a sensitive nature. What the medical examiner's findings made undeniable was the scale of what had happened. The ballistic evidence alone indicated that whoever was responsible had discharged a firearm a significant number of times, had stopped at least twice to reload, and had continued after the victim was no longer alive. This was not a single impulsive act. The forensic picture described something sustained, deliberate, and systematic. The investigation had now formally changed shape. This was no longer a missing persons case. The forensic evidence demanded a different kind of inquiry entirely, and the question of who had last been seen with Kathy Bonney on the night of November 21st had a very specific answer that investigators were already beginning to examine far more carefully. On the morning of November 23rd, Detective Martin Williams drove to Tom Bonney's place of business to speak with him in person. Bonney was cooperative. He was engaged. He offered information without being pressed for it. He told Williams that Kathy had been involved with John Hoskins, a former employee he had let go approximately 10 days earlier. He mentioned the letter he had found in her room. He seemed bothered that Williams kept it as evidence rather than returning it to the family. Then he repeated his account of November 21st, word for word, beat for beat. The same story he had given at the police department the morning before. He had taken Kathy to the 7-Eleven to meet a man named John who was selling a Chevrolet Blazer. Kathy had gone for a test drive at around 9 o'clock. She had not come back. He had no explanation for where she might be. Investigators took the Hoskins lead seriously. They had to. It was the only name they had been given with any specificity, and it had come from the victim's own father. They looked at Hoskins. They examined his background, his movements, his connection to Kathy, and his whereabouts on the night of November 21st. What they found gave them nothing. No physical evidence connecting him to the scene. No forensic link to Kathy's disappearance. No credible reason to elevate him as a person of interest. The Hoskins line closed out as a dead end, and investigators were back where they started. On November 24th, SBI agent Malcolm McLeod accompanied Bonney on a drive to look for the Blazer that the fictional John had allegedly been selling. During that outing, Bonney told McLeod something specific. On the night of November 21st, he said he had driven his wrecker to the 7-Eleven, not his Chevrolet. His wrecker. McLeod noted it and moved on. It seemed like a minor logistical detail at the time. On November 27th, Detective Robert Castello sat down with Bonney to work on a composite drawing of the man named John. Bonney participated without hesitation. He described the man's features with the kind of quiet, cooperative specificity that investigators generally associate with a genuine witness trying to help. A face was produced. It was circulated. Investigators began the work of trying to place that face against a real person somewhere in the area. That same evening, Detective Williams spoke with Bonney again about the vehicle. And here, for the first time, something shifted in a way that could not be explained away as a simple misremembering. On this occasion, Bonney stated that he had driven his Chevrolet to the 7-Eleven on the night of November 21st. Not the wrecker, the Chevrolet. 3 days earlier, he had told Agent McLeod the opposite. Williams noted the contradiction carefully. He did not confront Bonney with it directly. Not yet, but it went into the file. On November 30th, Bonney told Williams he had sold the Chevrolet a few days earlier to a man whose name he could not provide. Williams began looking for the car. On December 3rd, Bonney came into the station to look at photographs. He again stated he had driven the Chevrolet on the night in question. That was now 2 occasions on which he had said Chevrolet, against 1 occasion on which he had said wrecker. The contradiction was documented and sitting in the investigative file, unresolved. On December 4th, Williams asked Bonney directly whether he had ever owned a 9-shot, .22 caliber revolver. Bonney said he used to own one but had sold it to a man whose name he could not recall. Williams then asked him plainly whether he had been responsible for what happened to Kathy. Bonney denied it. He kept repeating that the investigators were wrong. He also maintained, at this stage, that the photographs of the victim recovered from the canal were not photographs of his daughter. But here is where the investigation turned in a direction that no tip or composite sketch had been able to provide. In December 1987, Susan Bonney went to police. She told them she had seen what appeared to be staining consistent with biological material in her father's car on the night Kathy disappeared. She told them she was afraid of her father. This was not a casual observation passed through a third party. This was a direct statement to law enforcement from someone inside the Bonney household, delivered with the specific weight of genuine fear behind it. Investigators moved on the Chevrolet immediately. Forensic testing of the front passenger seat returned a positive result for the presence of biological material. Further laboratory analysis confirmed it was human in origin and consistent with Kathy Bonney's blood type. Additional material consistent with her blood type was recovered from the passenger door handle. The undergarment recovered from the water near the canal also tested consistent with her blood type. And then SBI agent Troy Hamlin examined hair samples taken from the rear into the trunk of that same vehicle. Those samples were found to be consistent with known hair samples taken from Kathy Bonney. The car Bonney had attempted to sell in the days after his daughter disappeared had forensic evidence in the front seat, on the door handle, and hair consistent with Kathy's in the trunk. On December 10th, Bonney himself called Detective Williams. He told him he had located the Chevrolet at a dealership called London Bridge Motors in Virginia Beach. Police arrived and seized the vehicle. Then, on December 11th, Tom Bonney was gone. He did not inform his wife he was leaving. He made no arrangements for his children. He simply disappeared. Dorothy Bonney, left behind with the knowledge of what forensic examiners had found in that current with a husband who had now vanished, went into hiding out of fear of him. Social services took custody of the remaining Bonney children. The man who had spent 3 weeks sitting across from detectives, describing a suspect he had invented, helping police construct a face that belonged to nobody, had run. The composite was set aside. The search for John Hoskins was long closed. The focus was now singular and it was clear. Investigators needed to find Thomas Lee Bonney. Tips came in placing him in various states. He had been moving. He had not stayed anywhere long enough to be located. Days passed, then weeks. December became January. On January 31st, 1988, more than 6 weeks after he fled Chesapeake, Thomas Lee Bonney was apprehended in Indianapolis, Indiana. He was taken into custody without significant incident and arrangements were made to transport him back to North Carolina. On February 1st, Detective Williams and FBI agent Kevin McGinn is traveled to the jail in Indianapolis. They read Bonney his Miranda rights and sat down with him. And this time, the account he gave was different from anything he had offered before. Bonney told them that on Friday, November 20th, he had come across copies of the letters Kathy had written to Hoskins. He told them that on the following evening, November 21st, he had raised the subject of those letters with Kathy while they were in the Chevrolet, parked along the side of Highway 17. He said she had reached for the firearm he was carrying. He said it discharged. When Williams asked him directly whether he had been responsible for what happened to his daughter, Bonney said yes. He had been responsible. He had left her alongside Highway 17 and driven home. He said that something had snapped in his head. The following day, February 2nd, Williams and McGinn is returned to take Bonney to North Carolina. At the airport, Bonney expanded on what he had said. He and Kathy had argued about the letters. His firearm had been under his coat on the front seat. She had reached for it. He did not remember reloading. He did not remember precisely how many times the firearm had discharged, but he acknowledged that it had continued to discharge after the initial moment. He thought she had reacted when it first went off. He acknowledged that he had removed her clothing. He told investigators he had disposed of the firearm from a bridge into the river at Battlefield Boulevard. He said he had placed the spent shell casings into the gas tank of his wrecker. That last detail sent investigators directly to the wrecker. George Bess, an employee of Tabby S. Auto Parts, confirmed that sometime near the end of 1987 or the beginning of 1988 he had discovered 22 caliber shell casings inside the gas tank of a wrecker that had previously belonged to Bonney. Detective James Eames removed 25 spent shell casings and 1 live round from that tank. SBI agent Eugene Bishop, the firearms examination expert, tested those casings against the ballistic fragments recovered from Kathy's body during the forensic examination. At least 7 of those fragments had been discharged from the same firearm. Every one of the 25 spent casings from the wrecker's gas tank had been discharged by that same weapon. The absence of ejector marks on the casings confirmed the firearm had been a revolver, meaning the casings had been removed from the cylinder manually, by hand. After each series of discharges, they had then been carried away from the scene and placed deliberately inside the gas tank of a work vehicle. The ballistic and forensic record was now complete. The firearm that had been used had been thrown into a river, but the casings it had produced were sitting in evidence, recovered from exactly where Bonney himself had said they would be. His account and the physical evidence occupied the same space, and the picture they formed together left investigators with everything they needed to take Thomas Lee Bonney to trial. What the complete body of evidence now allowed investigators, and what it would allow a jury to know, was this: the sequence of events on the night of November 21st, 1987, could be reconstructed from the moment Tom Bonney and Kathy left the family home in Chesapeake to the moment he returned alone. Every significant claim in that reconstruction was anchored to a specific piece of physical evidence, a forensic finding, a witness observation, or Bonney's own admissions to law enforcement. Tom Bonney had spent Friday, November 20th, in possession of letters his daughter had written to John Hoskins. He read them. He said nothing to Kathy that day. He carried what he had read through the next 24 hours and into the following evening. On Saturday, November 21st, sometime after 7 o'clock in the evening, he told his wife and Susan that he was taking Kathy out to look at a truck. He had been on the phone with a man named John before they left, a detail he would later use to construct his false account. He and Kathy got into the Chevrolet together. His firearm was under his coat on the front seat. He had brought additional ammunition with him. This was not something he volunteered initially. It emerged only later, in his airport conversation with investigators on February 2nd. He had placed that firearm and those additional rounds in the vehicle before Kathy got in. He drove across the state line into North Carolina, onto Highway 17, which runs alongside the Dismal Swamp Canal through Camden County. At some point along that road, he stopped the car. He and Kathy argued. The argument was about the letters he had found, about Hoskins, about the life she had been living that he had not approved of. According to Bonney, Kathy reached for the firearm during the argument. He said it discharged, but here's where the forensic evidence directly contradicts the picture of an accidental or reactive discharge. The medical examiner's findings documented ballistic impacts across multiple regions of Kathy's body. The trajectory analysis established that 2 of those impacts had been delivered from an extremely close range to the left side of her head, the weapon within inches of her skull. Additional impacts were documented to her face, her neck, her chest, and her lower legs. The forensic timeline established clearly that the impacts to her chest had proven fatal, and that the impacts to her lower legs had been sustained after death had already occurred. The firearms examination evidence added a layer that the defense could not account for. Agent Eugene Bishop's analysis of the spent shell casings recovered from a gas tank of Bonney's wrecker established that all 25 casings had been fired by the same weapon that left ballistic fragments inside Kathy's body. And because those casings showed no ejector marks, meaning they had been manually removed from the cylinder rather than automatically ejected, the forensic picture described a revolver that had been deliberately unloaded and reloaded by hand. Given the total number of ballistic impacts documented by the medical examiner, the firearms evidence indicated that the cylinder had been emptied and reloaded a minimum of 2 times during the course of the event. Each reload was a deliberate mechanical action. The cylinder had to be opened. The spent casings had to be removed by hand. Fresh rounds had to be loaded. The cylinder had to be closed. And then the firearm had to be raised again. That sequence repeated at least twice, was what the forensic and ballistic evidence described. Not a single reactive discharge. A sustained and repeated series of deliberate actions. The spent casings from those reloads were not left at the scene. They were not found along the highway or in the grass near the canal. They turned up in the gas tank of his wrecker, placed there by Bonney himself at some point after the event. A deliberate act of concealment. He had collected those casings, carried them away, and hidden them inside a vehicle he used for work. After the event concluded, Bonney removed Kathy's clothing. The forensic evidence, specifically the vegetation fibers recovered from her hair and the ballistic damage documented in the small trees along the embankment, was consistent with the body having been moved from the vehicle to the edge of the embankment and pushed over. The steepness of the bank made it physically impossible for a person to have carried a body down to where it came to rest. Sergeant Lewis had concluded at the scene that she had been dumped. The physical evidence supported the conclusion entirely. Bonney then drove back to Chesapeake. At some point during or after the drive, he disposed of the firearm from a bridge into the river at Battlefield Boulevard. He arrived home, walked through the front door, and asked his family if anyone knew where Kathy was. The motive, as Bonney himself framed it, was the confrontation over those letters, the discovery of his daughter's private life, her relationship with a man he had fired, the specific language she had used in writing to that man, and the argument that followed in the car. He would later tell reporters, after his arrest in Indianapolis, that they had just had a disagreement, that the firearm had just discharged. When asked why the forensic evidence documented the scale of injuries it did, he said, simply, "I just cracked." What the evidence described was something more specific than cracking. He had brought the firearm. He had brought additional ammunition. He had driven across the state line. He had stopped on a specific stretch of road alongside a canal in the dark. The ballistic and forensic record documented a sustained series of deliberate actions, including continued discharge after death had occurred, manual collection of the spent casings, removal of the victim's clothing, disposal of the body down an embankment, concealment of the casings inside a work vehicle, and disposal of the firearm from a bridge. He had then driven home and constructed a false account that he maintained for 3 weeks, including sitting with a police detective and helping draw the face of a man who did not exist. Thomas Lee Bonney was indicted on a charge of first-degree murder in the death of Kathy Carol Bonney. Under North Carolina law, first-degree murder carried to possible sentences, life in prison, or death. The prosecution pursued the death penalty. The first trial began in Elizabeth City, North Carolina, on October 17, 1988, nearly a year after Kathy's body had been found alongside the dismal swamp canal. It ran for 7 weeks, and from the opening of proceedings, the central battleground was not whether Tom Bonney had been responsible for his daughter's death. He had admitted that. The battleground was the condition of his mind when it happened. Bonney's court-appointed attorneys, John Halstead and John Morrison, entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. Their argument rested entirely on a diagnosis developed through a series of interviews conducted by clinical psychologist Drive, Code Dell, beginning in July of 1988. Dell had spent months with Bonney, administering personality tests and conducting sessions, many of them using hypnosis. Based on that work, Dell formed a specific clinical opinion. Thomas Lee Bonney suffered from multiple personality disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and mixed personality disorder. His primary diagnosis was multiple personality disorder. Dell testified that he had identified 10 separate personalities within Bonney through the use of hypnosis. He named them individually for the court. Tom, the host personality; Satan, Mamie, Demian, Viking, Tommy, Hitman, Preacher, Dad, and Kathy. Each personality, Dell explained, had a specific psychological function. Each one existed to help Bonney cope with a particular trauma he had experienced across his life. The triggering trauma for the development of the disorder, in Dell's assessment, had been the death of Bonney's maternal grandmother when Bonney was 10 years old. Dell's testimony on the night of the incident was direct. The personality in control at the time was Demian. Demian was characterized by uncontrolled rage, and according to Dell, Demian had not believed he was confronting Kathy at all. Demian believed he was confronting Bonney's abusive father. Dell stated that at the moment of the incident, Bonney was incapable of knowing the nature and quality of his actions and could not distinguish right from wrong. The videotaped sessions between Dell and Bonney were admitted into evidence and played for the jury. In one of those recordings, Bonney claimed that Kathy was still alive and that she visited him every night in his prison cell. The prosecution's response came through Drive. Philip Coons, a psychiatrist and expert in both multiple personality disorder and hypnosis, who had reviewed approximately 13 hours of the videotaped sessions between Dell and Bonney. Coons had not interviewed Bonney personally and offered no independent diagnosis. What he offered instead was a precise methodological critique of Dell's work. Coons testified that Dell had not conducted a proper psychiatric interview before beginning hypnosis. He had allowed Bonney to speak without structure. He had asked leading questions throughout. And critically, while Bonney was under hypnosis, Dell had improperly suggested to him that he might have other personalities. Coons stated plainly that the symptoms of multiple personality disorder could be produced by exactly that kind of suggestive hypnotic technique. He also testified that the loss of a family member was not, in his professional opinion, a sufficient trauma to produce multiple personality disorder. A third medical voice entered the proceedings through Drive. Bob Rollins, a forensic psychiatrist who had treated Bonney at Dorothea Dix Hospital for a period in late September and early October of 1988, just weeks before the trial began. Rollins had examined Bonney directly and provisionally agreed that Bonney presented with serious mental health concerns, offering a tentative diagnosis consistent with multiple personality disorder. He found that at the time of the incident Bonney had suffered from a disease of the mind and from defective reasoning. But then Rollins drew a line that the defense needed him not to draw. In his opinion, despite all of that, Bonney did know the nature and quality of his act at the time, and he did know the difference between right and wrong. John McClung, Bonney's former business partner, testified for the defense. He described Bonney's deteriorating behavior in the period before the incident, his poor memory, his mood swings, his complicated relationship with his own father. He said that near the time of the incident Bonney had not been acting like himself, not like someone in his right mind. But on cross-examination, McClung acknowledged something he had previously stated, that Tom Bonney was streetwise. That Tom Bonney knew the difference between right and wrong. There were procedural complications during the trial itself. A juror was found to have brought a library book, titled The Complete Jack the Ripper, into the jury room. The trial court examined the juror directly, determined he had not read it, had not discussed its contents with anyone, and denied Bonney's motion for a mistrial. A second motion for mistrial followed after the same juror was reported to have been exposed to television news coverage of the case. The court examined him again, found he had not intentionally watched the coverage and had left the room when the trial was mentioned, and denied that motion as well. A third motion came after the prosecutor asked Dell during cross-examination whether Bonney had, while living in Texas, fathered a daughter and then abandoned her in a motel room. Dell said he had not known that. Bonney erupted in the courtroom, stating loudly that the claim was false. The prosecutor acknowledged He had a report from a social services agency as the basis for the question. The court ruled the questions improper, instructed the jury to disregard them entirely, and denied the mistrial motion. On November 25, 1988, after 7 weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury found Thomas Lee Bonney guilty of first-degree murder on the theory of premeditation and deliberation. 5 days later, on November 30th, the jury recommended the death sentence. The trial court entered that sentence formally. Bonney appeals. On June 12, 1991, the North Carolina Supreme Court issued its ruling. The court upheld the first-degree murder conviction without reservation. The evidence of premeditation and deliberation was, in the court's assessment, substantial and clear. But the death sentence was a different matter entirely. The court found that the jury in the original trial had been improperly instructed during the sentencing phase. Specifically, the jury had been told that it could only consider a mitigating circumstance if it found that circumstance unanimously. Under a United States Supreme Court ruling in McCoy v. North Carolina, that instruction was unconstitutional. Individual jurors had to be free to consider mitigating circumstances they personally found credible, regardless of whether the full jury agreed. Because the defense had presented substantial evidence of mitigating factors, including the mental health testimony, the court could not say beyond a reasonable doubt that the improper instruction had not affected the sentencing outcome. The death sentence was vacated. The case was remanded to Camden County Superior Court for a new capital sentencing hearing. Bonney underwent psychiatric examination to determine his competency to stand trial again. He was found competent. The resentencing hearing was scheduled and began in Chowan Superior Court on August 24, 1992. The new jury of 12, selected from a pool of 150 people, was not being asked to relitigate guilt. That question had been settled by the original conviction and upheld by the Supreme Court. They were being asked only to fix the punishment. Susan Bonney, then 19 years old, the same age Kathy had been, testified against her father at this hearing. She told the court that when her father came home on the night of the incident without Kathy, she had felt immediately that something was not right. She described asking him where Kathy was, and she described what he did in response. He sat on the couch, she said, and he laughed, as hard as he could. He laughed that Kathy was gone. The hearing did not reach a conclusion. The following day, Bonney had an outburst in the courtroom that his attorneys told the judge they could not control. They informed the court that their client was incapable of understanding the proceedings and that they could not get him to follow their instructions. The judge ordered a psychiatric evaluation. Dr. Rollins testified that Bonney was evasive, stubborn, and angry. The judge declared a mistrial and ordered Bonney into a new round of psychiatric treatment, suspending all further proceedings until he was declared fit to face sentencing a third time. That process extended across the following years. Every time the question of competency was revisited, the proceedings stalled or reset. The question of punishment remained formally open for nearly 2 decades after the original conviction. And then, on October 16, 2007, Camden County Superior Court sentenced Thomas Lee Bonney to life in prison. The years between the original conviction and the final sentencing had not passed quietly for Thomas Lee Bonney. He had not waited inside the system with patience or resignation. He had tested it, pushed against it, and on at least 2 occasions broken through it entirely. The first attempt came during the original trial itself. While being transported in a vehicle, Bonney jumped from the car. He was handcuffed at the time. He ran approximately 50 feet before he was apprehended. He was a short, desperate, unsuccessful lead, and it was noted and then largely absorbed into the larger machinery of the proceedings that continued around him. The second attempt was something else entirely. On July 29, 1994, at approximately 8:30 in the morning, Thomas Lee Bonney and a fellow inmate named James Stromer disappeared from Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina. The facility was 12 years old at the time, and this was the first escape in its history. Prison officials pieced together what had happened over the hours that followed, and what they concluded was difficult to believe. The two men had climbed into a detachable trash compacting chute and hidden there. A garbage truck came, collected the compactor, and drove away from the prison with both men inside it. The immediate assumption, shared by correctional officials and reported widely in the press, was that neither man had survived. The compactor mechanism worked by hydraulically ramming everything inside it. There was, according to one correctional officer who spoke to the Associated Press, no way anyone could survive the compacting unless the compactor happened to be empty at the time. By nightfall on July 30th, police combing the Raleigh landfill where the truck had deposited its load had found no sign of either man. The working theory shifted between escape and accidental death inside the machine, and for a period of time both possibilities sat open simultaneously. As it turned out, the compactor had been empty. Both men had survived. They had stolen a car and driven to Hampton Beach. Bonney was captured by police for days later. He offered no resistance when they found him. He explained that the escape had been a spontaneous decision, not a planned one. But the explanation he gave for why he had done it was specific and, in its own way, entirely human. While he had been on death row, his mother had died. He had been unable to attend her funeral. He had never been able to visit her grave. That was the first thing he did after the escape. He went to her grave. He also went to the grave of his daughter Kathy. After that, he said, he had simply wandered around the Ocean View area. He told investigators that if he had not been caught, he would have turned himself in within a few days anyway, because he had injured himself during the escape and needed food and medication. District Attorney H.P. Williams Jr., who had prosecuted the original case, was not surprised by the escape. He told reporters that in his opinion Tom Bonney was an intelligent individual who was entirely capable of planning something like this. The Assistant District Attorney, Frank Parrish, went further. He said he had never believed Bonney was incompetent, and that the escape had demonstrated exactly that. For Dorothy Bonney and for the children who had grown up in that house, the years after the conviction had required a different kind of survival. Dorothy had gone into hiding in December 1987, while her husband was still at large, out of fear of what he might do. Social services had taken custody of the remaining children during that period. The family had been scattered by the same event that had taken Kathy, and the process of rebuilding any kind of ordinary life had begun under the weight of everything that had happened inside the household and everything that had since become public knowledge about it. Susan Bonney had found the courage to speak. She had gone to police in December 1987 when she was afraid. She had testified at the resentencing hearing in 1992 when she was 19, the same age Kathy had been when she died. She had stood in a courtroom and described her father laughing on the couch the night her sister did not come home. That act of testimony, given by a young woman who had grown up in a house built around silence and control, was not a small thing. Kathy's story was considered significant enough that author Ted Schwartz documented it in a published book titled Deadly Whispers, and the case was later adapted into a television film of the same name. For a young woman whose life was taken before it had fully opened, that is a form of remembrance. Her name, and the truth of what happened to her, reached an audience that extended far beyond the courtroom in Elizabeth City, far beyond the canal in Camden County, where she was left. Her story did not disappear with her. What this case makes visible, in a way that is specific to its particular shape, is what can exist inside a relationship that looks entirely ordinary from the outside. A father and daughter, a family home, a man known in his community, with a business and a long-standing reputation. The danger in this case did not arrive from outside. It had been present inside that house for years, in the way the household was run, and the physical abuse Kathy had described to McClung, in a rigid control over who his children could see and what they could do with their own lives. The letters Tom Bonney found did not create a dangerous man. They handed a dangerous man a specific grievance on a specific evening. The distinction matters, because the warning signs in cases like this one are not dramatic. They are structural. They are in the rules that cannot be questioned, in the doors that cannot be opened, in the conversations that cannot be had. They are in the ordinary. If you found this case fascinating, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. We post real crime case videos every week. Until next time, always remember to stay alert and stay safe.